The market at the edge of the spaceport was alive with noise and smells. Vendors shouted about fresh fruits, glowing fabrics, and strange animals locked in cages. Ships rumbled overhead as they landed or took off, shaking the ground under people's feet. It was a normal day for the crowd, until she appeared. She moved slowly through the market, her head low, her steps unsteady. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her clothes hung loose from her thin frame. Her long hair was tangled, and dust clung. To her bare feet, she did not look at anyone for long. Just kept walking like she was looking for something. But her stomach growled so loudly that even a passing child turned to stare. She stopped at a food stall where thick bread was stacked. "Hi," the vendor, a wide man with oily hands, leaned forward. "What do you want, girl?" he asked in a slow, mocking tone. Her voice was soft, almost lost under the noise. "All I have are my clothes." The vendor blinked, then grinned. "Oh," he said, "I understand." He leaned closer so only she could hear, but his voice carried to those near enough. "If you want food, you'll have to give me those clothes." All of them. The girl froze, her eyes darting to the bread, then to the crowd. People nearby began to turn and watch. Some smirked, others looked away like they had seen this before. A few even whispered. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge of her worn shirt. The vendor folded his arms, waiting. "Well," T said, "are you hungry or not?" Her lips pressed together. She looked around as if searching for another option. But no one stepped forward. Her face went pale, then flushed as she slowly began to pull at the knot that held her shirt closed. The crowd grew silent, only the sound of the market in the distance breaking through. That's when a new voice cut through the air, firm and sharp. "That's enough." The vendor's head snapped up. A tall human man stood just a few steps away. He had broad shoulders, a dark coat, and eyes that didn't blink. The crowd shifted, giving him space without being asked. The girl's hands stopped moving. Her eyes locked on him like she wasn't sure if he was real. The human stepped closer to the stall. He didn't raise his voice, but every word felt heavy. "She's not for sale." The vendor laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This isn't your business, human," he said. She offered. "She knows the price." The man's jaw tightened. "I'll pay for her food," he said flatly, pulling out a handful of credits. "Full price." The vendor stared at the credits, then at the man. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, just to be stubborn, but greed won. He snatched the credits and shoved a bag of bread and dried meat toward the girl. "Take it and get out," he muttered. The girl clutched the bag like it was treasure. Her hands shook as she tore off a piece of bread and bit into it. Tears welled in her eyes at the first taste. She ate quickly, like someone who hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. The human stood beside her, keeping his gaze on the vendor until the man looked away. "What's your name?" he asked her quietly. She swallowed hard before answering. "Lyra." Her voice was small, almost shy. He nodded once. "Where do you live, Lyra?" Her eyes dropped to the ground, and she didn't answer. That told him enough. "You have nowhere to go," he said. She kept her head down. He let out a slow breath. "Come on," he said finally. "You're with me now." The crowd parted. As he led her away from the stall, whispers followed them. Why's he taking her? Doesn't he know who she is? Lyra kept close to him, still eating as they walked. The human didn't look back. He didn't need to. The market. Noise faded behind them, but the stares stayed in his mind. Something about the way people had looked at her. It wasn't just pity or cruelty, it was fear. He didn't know her story yet. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever trouble she carried, she was not going to face it alone anymore. The walk away from the market felt longer than it should. The streets near the spaceport were a maze of metal alleys, neon signs, and the smell of oil. Lyra kept her head down. Clutching the bag of food to her chest like it could vanish any second, she chewed quickly. Swallowing each bite as if afraid someone might snatch it from her hands, the human stayed beside her. His long steps slowing so she could keep up. He glanced at her a few times but didn't push her to speak. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only safe thing for someone who had been through too much. When they turned into a narrow lane, he finally broke the quiet. "I'm Rourke," he said. His voice even Lyra didn't answer right away. She looked up at him for a brief second, then nodded. "Why? Why did you stop him?" she asked softly. Rourke shrugged because it was wrong. Her brow furrowed, like the idea itself didn't make sense to her. Ahead, two workers leaned against a wall, watching them pass. One of them spat on the ground and muttered something in a language Rourke didn't recognize. The other snickered, shaking his head. Rourke ignored them. But Lyra's shoulders hunched tighter. "They don't like me," she whispered. "Why?" he asked. "They think I bring bad luck," she said, her voice trembling. "They call me cursed." Rourke stopped walking for a moment. "Do you believe that?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. "Everyone who takes me in. Something happens to them," she murmured. "Bad things. They say it's my fault." He looked at her carefully. "Maybe bad things happened," he said. "But that doesn't make it your fault." She didn't reply, just kept her gaze on the ground. Rourke sighed quietly and started walking again. "Come on. You need somewhere safe to stay." They reached the outer docking ring of the port. Where smaller ships were berthed, the lights were dim here, and most of the crew had gone to the bars or bunkhouses for the night. Dock 42 was near the far end. Rourke's ship sat there, a worn but sturdy freighter with patched hull plates and a faint hum from its engines. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp, turning to face her. "This is my ship," he said. Lyra's eyes widened. You own it?" Rourke smirked faintly. "Own is a strong word. Let's just say I keep it running." She stayed at the base of the ramp, her hands gripping the food bag. "You can come in," he told her. "You'll be safe here." Her gaze flicked to the ship's dark interior. "Safe." She repeated, like it was a word she wasn't used to saying, after a moment. She stepped forward and followed him inside. The freighter's main hold smelled faintly of fuel and old metal. There was a small kitchen unit, a row of storage lockers, and a narrow corridor leading deeper into the ship. Rourke gestured toward a chair near the kitchen. "Sit," he said. "Eat properly. You don't have to rush now." Lyra obeyed, but her eyes kept darting to the hatch, as if she was ready to run if needed. As she ate, Rourke rummaged through a crate, pulling out a folded blanket. "Where were you staying before the market?" he asked. Lyra's chewing slowed. "I wasn't," she said simply. "I slept in the docks, sometimes under the fuel pipes, sometimes behind the scrap piles." Rourke's jaw tightened. "How long?" She shrugged. Since they left me." Her voice cracked at the last words. And she looked away. Rourke placed the blanket on the table in front of her. "You can stay here," he said. "No rent, no work, nothing. Just stay." Her eyes shot up to his. Disbelief plain in her face. "Why?" she asked. "Because no one should be alone out there," he replied. "You're not a problem to me." "Lyra." She shook her head. "You don't know what happens to people who help me." He leaned on the table, his voice steady. "I don't care about curses. I care about you." For a long moment, she just stared at him. No one had ever said something like that to her before. It felt strange, almost dangerous, to hear it. The hum of the ship's systems filled the quiet between them. Finally, she whispered, "I can clean, or cook, or help fix things." Rourke smiled faintly. "If you want to help, fine. But you don't owe me anything." Outside, faint footsteps echoed in the docking bay. Rourke glanced toward the hatch, his instincts prickling. He didn't see anyone yet. But something in the air told him trouble wasn't far behind. He pushed the thought aside for now and turned back to Lyra. "Finish eating," he said. "Then I'll show you where you can sleep." As she nodded and took another bite, he realized that whatever her past was, it was already chasing her. And now, by stepping in, it was chasing him too. But he didn't regret it, not for a second. Morning in Dock 42 came with the sound of distant engines and the faint temps of burning fuel. Rourke stood at the ship's hatch, checking the locking mechanisms while Lyra sat at the table. Eating slowly, she looked less pale than the night before, but her eyes still darted toward every sound. "You eat like you're expecting someone to take it away," he said quietly. Lyra froze mid-bite and lowered her gaze. "That's how it always was," she murmured. He said nothing more, just made a mental note. Trust would take time. When they stepped off the ship to get supplies, the air in the docking bay felt heavier. Several workers stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Some whispered, others simply stared. Rourke ignored them, but his jaw tightened. He wasn't imagining it. There was something in the way they looked at her. It wasn't just dislike, it was fear mixed with disgust. At the edge of the bay, an older alien woman stepped into their path. Her skin was a faded blue, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "You should leave her," the woman said bluntly to Rourke. "She's marked. Bad luck follows her." Lyra froze, the bag of food in her hands trembling. Rourke's eyes narrowed. "Marked? By who?" The woman shook her head. "Not by who. By what? She's cursed. Every ship that takes her in meets an end." Rourke stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Or maybe people just like to blame the weak for their own bad luck." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Keep her if you want, human. Just don't say you weren't warned." With that, she turned and walked away. They continued into the market, but the whispers only grew. "She's still alive. Doesn't the human know?" "Won't last the week." Lyra kept her head down, clutching her food and supplies tighter. Rourke leaned toward her, speaking low so only she could hear. "Do you want to tell me what that was about?" She hesitated, then whispered, "It's not just a rumor. My last crew. They all died." Rourke slowed his pace. "How?" She shook her head. "Raiders, ship fire. Some fell sick. Everyone says I'm the reason." Her voice broke at the last word. "I didn't do anything, but keeps happening." He studied her for a long moment. "And yet, you're still here," he said finally. "That's not a curse. That's survival." She didn't answer, but a tiny flicker passed in her eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe hope. On the way back to the ship, they passed a small repair shop. The owner, a short, gruff alien with mechanical arms, stepped into the doorway. "Human," he called. "You're new here. Advice for you. Throw that one back where you found her." Rourke stopped, his tone sharp. Why does everyone care so much about someone they claim is worthless? The shopkeeper smirked. "Because no one wants to clean up after the mess she brings." Rourke took a step forward. "Funny thing," he said. "If she's so dangerous, why is she still breathing? Looks like the only real danger around here is how people treat her." The shopkeeper's smile faded. "You'll see soon enough, human. You'll see." Back aboard the freighter, Lyra sat silently at the small kitchen counter while Rourke stowed the supplies. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't protect me. They'll come for you too." Rourke turned, resting a hand on the table. "I've dealt with worse than gossip and superstition." Her eyes met his, full of confusion. "Why?" she asked. "Because you matter," he replied simply. "And I don't let go of people I decide to stand with." That night, as the freighter's lights dimmed, Rourke stood by the hatch, scanning the bay outside. A figure moved in the shadows. Watching his ship, then disappearing into the far corridor, he made a note to sleep lightly. Inside, Lyra lay on the small cot he'd given her. Staring at the ceiling, the food had filled her stomach, but her mind was still restless. No one had ever stood up for her this many times in one day. She wasn't sure if that made Rourke brave or doomed. Either way, she knew the whispers would turn into something worse. They always did. The freighter drifted quietly in its berth, its hull faintly glowing under the docking bay lights. Inside, the hum of the life support systems was the only sound. Rourke sat at the small table with a mug of steaming calf, watching Lyra as she sat on the cot across the room. She was quiet, her eyes distant. He had seen that look before, someone staring into memories they wished they could erase. "You're somewhere else right now," he said finally. Lyra blinked as if waking from a dream. "I'm remembering," she murmured. Rourke set down the mug, leaning forward. "Want to tell me about it?" She hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket he'd given her. "You won't believe me," she whispered. "Try me," he replied, his tone steady. She took a long breath, her voice trembling at first. "I wasn't born in the city. I lived in a small settlement on a green world far from here. It was quiet, peaceful. Until they came." Rourke stayed silent, letting her continue. "Raiders," she said, her voice hardening. "They burned everything. Homes, fields, people. They didn't care. They took the survivors, loaded us onto their ships like cargo." Her hands tightened around the blanket. "I was 12 when it happened. They sold the others quickly. Workers, fighters, anyone strong. But no one wanted me. They said I was bad luck even then, the first crew that bought me. Their ship's engines failed during a jump. Half of them died before rescue came. When I was sold again. The next captain was shot in a port fight 2 days later. After that, the curse story spread." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away from him. "They stopped paying for me. They just traded me off like scrap. Sometimes they'd leave me behind on some station. Sometimes they'd use me to bargain for supplies. And every time, something bad happened to whoever took me." And Rourke's jaw tightened. "You think that means you're cursed?" Her voice broke. "What else could it be? I never wanted anyone hurt, but they all ended up dead or ruined." He shook his head slowly. "Or maybe the kind of people who take you in are the kind already dancing on the edge of trouble." She stared at him, unsure if she wanted to believe that. "Then why are you still here?" she asked softly. "Most would have thrown me back into the street by now." Rourke leaned back in his chair. "Because I don't scare easy, and I don't believe in curses. I've seen enough to know bad luck is just life. It happens to everyone. The difference is, I choose who I face it with, for the first time." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. She opened her mouth to speak, but the ship's proximity alarm beeped once. Rourke turned his head toward the console, frowning. The dock sensors had picked up movement outside. A figure was approaching the hatch slowly. Stopping just out of the camera's view, Lyra stiffened, clutching the blanket tighter. "They've come back," she whispered. "Who?" Rourke asked, already moving toward the control panel. "The ones from the market," she said, her voice trembling. "They won't stop. They'll want me." Rourke checked the feed, but the figure stayed in the shadows. He reached for the pistol holstered at his side. "Stay here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument as he moved toward the hatch. Lyra's mind pulled her backward into memory. The smell of smoke, the heat of flames, the sound of shouting hands, dragging her across a floor. A voice saying, "We can trade her. She's worth something." Then the faces of those who had taken her in, one after another, each fading away in death. She had stopped counting after the 10th. Now, in the small freighter, her heart pounded. As she heard Rourke's boots on the deck plates, a metallic clang echoed as the outer ramp shifted slightly. She wanted to tell him to lock the hatch, to just fly away, but part of her was terrified that if he left her, she'd never see him again. The ship stayed silent for a long moment. Then Rourke's voice came from the corridor. "It's fine." Just a dockhand dropping off a fuel invoice, he stepped back into the room, but his eyes were sharp. He knew someone had been watching them earlier, and he didn't like it. Lyra relaxed only slightly, but in her gut, she knew it wasn't. People didn't just watch her for curiosity, they waited. Waited for the right moment. Rourke sat back down, his voice calm but firm. "Whatever your past is, it's not going to decide your future." She looked at him for a long time, then gave a small, almost invisible nod. For the first time in years, she wanted to believe someone, but somewhere in the docking bay, in the shadows beyond the cameras, someone else was smiling. They had found the cursed girl again, and this time they weren't leaving without her. The docking bay was quiet that night, too quiet. Rourke thought as he checked the ship's systems one last time before turning in. Most crews had already left for the bars or their quarters, and the few lights that still burned cast long shadows. On the walls inside the freighter, Lyra sat cross-legged on the cot. She was trying to sew the tear in her shirt with a bent needle Rourke had found for her. The hum of the engines soothed her, for the first time in a long time. She felt like she could breathe without looking over her shoulder. Then came the pounding. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks on the outer hatch. Not a friendly tap, a demand. Rourke's head snapped toward the sound. Lyra froze, the needles slipping from her fingers. "Stay here," he told her, his voice low but firm. He grabbed his sidearm from the table and moved toward the hatch. The pounding came again. Harder this time. A voice followed, rough and mocking. "Open up, human. We've come for what's ours." Rourke's hand hovered over the hatch controls. "What do you want?" He called back, laughter echoed from the other side. "You know what we want? The cursed girl. Give her to us, and we'll leave you breathing." Lyra's heart thudded in her chest. She slid off the cot and pressed herself into the corner of the room. She knew that voice. It was the vendor from the market. The one Rourke had stopped, and if he was here, he wouldn't be alone. Rourke's thumb rested on the safety of his pistol. "You've got 3 seconds to walk away," he said, his voice sharp as glass. The answer was another laugh. 3 seconds? You think we're afraid of one man?" There was a hiss of hydraulics as someone outside began forcing the outer ramp controls. Rourke cursed under his breath and hit the manual lock. Metal groaned, but the ramp held. "For now, Lyra," he called over his shoulder without looking. "Go to the back compartment and stay there." Her voice shook. "They won't stop." "Not until go." He snapped, not out of anger, but urgency. The pounding grew louder, joined by a scraping sound, someone trying to cut into the lock mechanism. Rourke's mind raced. If they got inside, the tight space of the freighter would work against him, but he also couldn't just step out into open ground against multiple attackers. Then came the shout, "Last chance, human. Give her up, or we come in and take her and your ship." Rourke pressed the intercom button. "I told you to walk away," he said. And then he cut the lights inside the ship, plunging the interior into darkness. Lyra crouched in the back compartment, clutching the blanket Rourke had given her. She could hear the banging from where she hid. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She hated this, hated being the reason someone else was in danger again. Outside, the sound of cutting metal stopped, replaced by the thud of boots on the ramp. Rourke's ears caught the faint click of a weapon being loaded. He positioned himself behind the bulkhead near the hatch, pistol raised, the first intruder. Tried the manual release again, and that's when Rourke hit the emergency hatch burst. Compressed air slammed into the ramp, throwing the first man off balance and sending him stumbling back into the others. Rourke didn't waste the moment. He stepped forward, grabbed the closest one by the jacket, and yanked him into the hatch frame. One punch to the gut, another to the jaw. The man went limp, The second attacker lunged forward, swinging a pipe. Rourke ducked, caught the man's arm, and twisted hard. The pipe clanged to the deck before the man could recover. Rourke shoved him back down the ramp. The third man hesitated, clearly rethinking his choices. But then the vendor himself stepped into view. His greasy grin looked even uglier under the dim bay lights. "You can't fight all of us, human," he sneered. "Maybe not," Rourke said. "But I can fight you." The vendor pulled a knife, its blade catching the light. Rourke didn't give him the chance to use it. 2 steps forward. A sharp kick to the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. A shove sent the vendor stumbling back. "This is your only warning." Rourke growled, "Come near her again, and you'll regret it." The vendor spat on the deck, but he backed away, motioning for the others to follow. "You'll see," he hissed. "The curse will get you too." Their footsteps faded into the shadows of the dock. Rourke waited a full minute before locking the hatch again. Only then did he lower his pistol. "Lyra," he called softly. She appeared at the corridor entrance, her eyes wide. You didn't give me up," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and relief. He gave her a faint smile. "Not my style." She stood there for a long moment, staring at him like she was seeing something she couldn't understand. And for the first time since they'd met, she took a step toward him, not away. Maybe the whispers were right, she thought. Bad things happened to those who kept her close. But maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't afraid of bad things at all. The ship stayed silent for almost an hour after the attackers left, but Rourke didn't relax. He sat by the hatch with his pistol resting on his knee, listening to every creak of the docking bay. He knew men like that didn't give up so easily. Lyra sat at the edge of the small table, her knees drawn to her chest. She hadn't touched the food he'd set out for her. She kept glancing toward the hatch. "They'll come back," she whispered. Rourke's eyes flicked to her. "Probably," he said, his voice calm. "But they won't catch us off guard." She looked at him, frowning. "You're not afraid? Of them?" "No," he replied. "What I'm afraid of is letting people think they can treat you like nothing and get away with it." The docking bay lights flickered once. Rourke's head snapped toward the small wall monitor. The power grid was fluctuating. He didn't like that. A moment later, all the lights went out, plunging the bay into darkness. Only the faint glow from the ship's emergency panels remained. Lyra's breathing quickened. "This is how it starts," she whispered. "Lyra." Rourke said sharply, "Focus. Stay close to me." A metallic clang echoed outside, followed by the faint hiss of air escaping a loosened seal. Rourke knew the sound. Someone was trying to breach a side panel of the ship. He moved quickly, grabbing a compact flashlight from the wall and handing it to her. "If I say run, you run to the engine room and lock the door." She swallowed hard and nodded. Another clang, closer this time. Rourke stepped into the corridor leading to the rear maintenance hatch. His boots made no sound on the metal floor. When he reached the corner, he crouched low and waited. The sound of metal being pried open grew louder. Then, with a sharp pop, the panel shifted and a shadowed figure slipped inside. Before the intruder could fully stand, Rourke surged forward. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other slamming the pistol grip into his ribs. The intruder grunted, dropped a small cutting tool, and tried to twist free. Rourke drove a knee into his leg. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. But more shadows were moving in behind him. Rourke's instincts screamed. He ducked. Just as a metal rod swung through the air where his head had been, he spun, catching the attacker's arm, twisting until the rod clanged to the deck. The second man kicked at him, but Rourke shoved him back into the wall, stunning him. The flashlight beam wavered down the corridor. "Rourke!" Lyra called, her voice tight with fear. "Stay there," he barked, not taking his eyes off the attackers. The first man scrambled for the cutting tool. Rourke stomped down on his hand, grabbed the tool, and tossed it aside. You should've stayed gone, he growled. The man spat a curse in a language Rourke didn't know. Rourke's elbow came down hard, ending the fight. The second attacker tried to make a run for it, but Lyra, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, stepped into his path. The sudden burst of light blinded him for a split second, just enough for Rourke to grab him from behind and slam him into the wall. The man went limp, sliding to the floor for a moment. The ship was still again. The only sound was Lyra's shaky breathing and Rourke's steady, controlled inhale. You protected me again, she said quietly. He turned to her, his tone softer now. That's what you do for people you care about. She blinked at him, almost startled by the word care. No one had used it for her in years. Her hands trembled as she lowered the flashlight. Why? She asked. Rourke didn't hesitate. Because you matter. Lyra and I don't give up on people outside the ship. Movement echoed again, but this time it was distant. The rest of the attackers had decided to retreat into the shadows. Rourke dragged the two unconscious men to the hatch, opened it just enough to push them outside, and sealed it again. Then he activated the secondary lock system. Anyone trying to get in now would have to cut through solid hull plating. Lyra stayed by the table, still holding the flashlight. Her eyes followed him as he checked every corner of the ship. Finally, he sat down across from her. Get some rest, he said. They won't try again tonight. She didn't move. You'll get hurt because of me, she murmured. Rourke leaned forward, meeting her gaze. Maybe. But if I do, it'll be on my terms, not because I walked away. For the first time, a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. And in the dim glow of the emergency lights, she realized that maybe her so-called curse wasn't strong enough to scare this human away. The next morning, the docking bay smelled of burnt fuel and damp metal after the night's rainstorm on the station's upper decks. Rourke had been awake for hours, running silent diagnostics on the freighter and double-checking every lock. Lyra sat quietly at the small table, sipping from a steaming mug of sweetened calf he had made for her. She still looked tired, but there was color in her face again. Where will you go today? She asked softly. Rourke glanced up from the control panel. He corrected. We're going to get off this station before those idiots try again. Her fingers tightened around the mug. You mean? I'm coming with you. Rourke's brow furrowed slightly. Lyra, you think I'd leave you here? After all this? She looked away, blinking hard. No one's ever wanted me to stay before, she murmured. He smiled faintly. Then, I guess, I'm the first. They loaded supplies into the freighter in silence. But as they moved through the docking bay, Rourke noticed the stairs again. Only this time, the whispers were different. Instead of mocking, there was something else. Unease, maybe even fear of him. Word of the fight had spread. And now, the same people who told him to throw Lyra away stepped aside when they passed. Once inside the freighter, Rourke sealed the hatch and began the pre-flight sequence. The hum of the engines filled the ship. Lyra stood near the co-pilot's chair, watching the starfield slowly appear through the viewport as the station's heavy doors began to open. Anywhere you want to go? He asked. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, she said, somewhere. Quiet. Somewhere no one knows me. He nodded. I can do that. As they lifted away from the docking bay, Lyra's hands gripped the back of the co-pilot's seat. Below them, the station's lights grew smaller. It was the first time in years she was leaving a place, not because she had been thrown out, but because she chose to when they were clear of the station's traffic lanes. Rourke set the autopilot and turned to her. You can take the bunk room, he said. It's small, but it's yours as long as you want it. She hesitated. You really don't want anything from me? Not work, not Anything else?" His voice was steady. "What I want is for you to eat, sleep, and remember what it feels like to be safe. That's all." Her eyes glistened. "You make it sound so simple." She said. "It is," he replied. "People just like to make it complicated." For a long time, they sat in quiet, the stars drifting past. Then, out of nowhere, Lyra reached into the small cloth bag she kept close and pulled something out, a tiny carved pendant. Worn smooth with age, she held it out too. "This is all I've kept from before," she said. "It's nothing valuable, but I want you to have it." Rourke took it, turning it over in his hand. "It's valuable because it's yours," he said, and slipped it into his coat pocket without hesitation. Hours passed, and the ship cruised through the black. Rourke made small talk about planets he'd visited, old jobs he'd taken, and crews he'd known. Lyra listened, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes frowning when he mentioned dangerous places. She was starting to picture herself there, not as cargo, not as a burden, but as part of a crew. When the nav system beeped, signaling a course shift, Rourke leaned back in his seat. "We'll reach the next system by morning," he said. "You'll like it, small trading post. Friendly enough people, and a market that doesn't try to strip you for food." She laughed softly at that. The sound was light, real, and it made Rourke glance over with a small smile as the ship continued forward. Lyra's mind wandered. She thought about all the places she'd been left behind, all the faces that had turned cold after a few days. And then she thought about this human, stubborn, calm, unshaken by every warning thrown at him. She wasn't sure yet if her curse was real, but she was sure of one thing: he didn't care. And that made her feel lighter than she had in years. Later, when the lights were dimmed for night cycle, she found herself standing by the viewport. Rourke was in the pilot's chair, watching the readings but not speaking. She stepped closer and said quietly, "I think I'm safe now." He glanced at her. "You are?" he said simply. The stars stretched into long lines as the freighter slipped into jump space. And for the first time since her life had been ripped apart, Lyra didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she was heading somewhere, somewhere new, somewhere hers. And this time, she wasn't alone.